So our first speaker for this session is Alan Thatcher. Alan is the founder of World Squash Day and Squash 200. He also runs the popular squash platform Squash Mad. His enthusiasm and passion for the sport is arguably second to none. Today, Alan will be talking about his plan to build 200 squash courts by 2030, the 200th anniversary of squash, and also the 20th World Squash Day happening in September this year. Just to remind you guys, on the right side of your desktop, we have a Q&A section. Please make sure you put your questions on there as Alan does his session, so we can ask him some of your questions at the end. Alan, are you ready?
Absolutely.
Amazing. We are so excited. The stage is yours.
Great stuff. Thank you, Kanzi. Good morning, everybody. A big thank you to Zushan, Furkan, and the whole team at Sportageous for setting up the Squash Summit. It was great hearing from Alex and Sarah Jane earlier on about the excellent work being done by the PSA, and also learning from Carlos about his amazing success with open air courts. That's a subject very close to my heart as well, but more of that shortly. We announced some great news yesterday with the dates for the Canary Wharf Classic confirmed for November. It should have taken place next week, of course, but obviously the big virus got in the way. It's been a tough year for all of us in squash, and I'm very grateful to be allowed this platform today to talk about rebooting and relaunching and reinvigorating the game later this year with World Squash Day. But first of all, I'd like to talk about the Squash 200 Consultancy and the work we are doing to build clubs for the future. The game of squash, as Kanzi pointed out, celebrates its 200th anniversary in 2030, and I set up Project 200 in conjunction with World Squash Day to encourage every nation, large and small, to come on board and use this vehicle to grow the game and do something very special in their own territory. Here in the UK, I set up the Squash 200 Consultancy to build 200 new courts in the next 10 years. Of course, we've all been affected by the pandemic and it stopped our official launch, but I've kept in touch with my network of contacts throughout lockdown, and we now have a dozen projects in the pipeline. Some are simple two-court extensions to existing facilities, and some others are really exciting new build projects. I have two partners in Squash 200, and first of all, I'd like to give a big shout out to the very talented Nick Thompson, owner of Melior Sports. Melior Sports is one of the sponsors of the Squash Summit, and I can tell you that Nick is an experienced court builder and has worked on numerous high-profile events, putting up the glass court at Canary Wharf, the Pyramids, and many other major tournaments in different parts of the world. He's also a very creative guy, and he's come up with some brilliant designs for new open-air courts, and yesterday he launched his very own interactive tin, which looks fantastic. Nick and I are joined by Lee Evans, the owner of the Southeast Steel Building Company. Lee is a former rugby union professional who played in the Premiership for Northampton, and he took up squash when injury halted his professional rugby career. Sadly, Lee stopped playing squash when his local David Lloyd Fitness Club shut down their courts. Lee was not alone, of course, because the David Lloyd Fitness chain shut down some 120 squash courts across the UK. Lee and I had already teamed up on an earlier building project in squash, and the whole David Lloyd situation led us to a very simple conclusion that we need squash people to take ownership of the game of squash and not rely on other people to build courts for us, because we are always at their mercy, knowing that the courts could be ripped out either on a whim or if a finance director decides that the squash operations are not making enough money for the parent business. Here in the UK, we are now at the point where squash no longer exists in many towns with populations of 100,000 and above. Now, that is a shocking piece of news, and I know that squash faces the same situation all over the world in many other nations. And again, I can only emphasize that for the game to survive, we need new courts and we need squash people to build them. We need squash people to own them, and we need squash people to manage them. We also need to plan these clubs and build them in such a way that they can be profitable businesses. And that's the best way, and probably the only way, to protect the game looking forward to the future. I'm glad that Lee and Nick both liked the Squash 200 concept, and we very quickly connected with potential clients in different parts of the UK, in Ireland, and even mainland Europe. We started working on a number of projects, but then along came COVID and we were unable to start building. However, we've been able to refine our whole approach in the past 12 months, and COVID has actually forced us to rethink several things. The need for open air courts, as Carlos has explained, is obvious, with indoor sports the first to be closed during lockdown. One of our guests this morning, Ferez Nalasa from New York, a doctor from New York, quite rightly is reminding everybody that this virus is likely to be with us for at least another decade. And so all of us involved in squash need to factor that in to any planning we're doing. And also the sport of squash needs to address one major issue that's holding the game back. And that's the fact that so many of our squash courts are hidden away inside private buildings. Many of these institutions are very expensive to join, with membership fees way beyond the pockets of ordinary folk. So that leads to a very important question: just what is a squash club? Many of our squash courts are in leisure centres or multi-sport venues, maybe led by tennis or fitness chains. We see courts in private, luxurious country clubs. Many capital cities have squash courts at exclusive business networking clubs. We have lots of courts in embassy compounds, universities, private schools, even army bases. Now, none of these really can be called simple squash clubs, but we've got into the habit of calling any facility with courts a squash club. And that really is a big, big mistake. We know that fitness chains across the world have been dropping squash for years, and this process accelerated during lockdown. Many fitness chains have gone bust in the last few months, as sadly did several major independent sports clubs with squash courts. And the rebuilding of our game has to start with the building of new squash clubs and new courts, both indoor and outdoor. And while we celebrate this extraordinary history of the game of squash, we clearly need to take the game in a new direction. Squash playing numbers have been falling for at least 25 years, and we see a similar decline in tennis. On the other hand, we have seen the phenomenal rise of padel in South America, in Spain, and across many other parts of Europe. And now padel is on the rise in North America. Pickleball is already firmly established as a major, fun, recreational sport in the USA, and it's also growing quickly in Canada. Now, please don't fall into the trap of thinking that pickleball is just a silly game with a funny name, because it now has a TV deal with ESPN and more than 4 million players in the USA. That's 4 million players that squash up with a solid social scene. Pickleball has grown by 25% in America in the last 12 months during a pandemic. And further growth in pickleball is assured with new funding coming into the sport all the time. One business owner in Texas is building nearly 200 new clubs across America in the next few years. Now, all this energy reminds me of what squash was like 40 years ago, but I don't see much of it around now. However, this morning, I'm seeing plenty of energy on the Squash Summit, and I can tell you that the team at Squash 200, we are all committed to throwing that energy at squash all over again. And we are looking for squash lovers with the same passion and the same energy to help us rebuild this fantastic sport of ours. For squash to compete in the racket sports sector, we need new clubs. New clubs run in a different way. We need them to be set up as community projects, providing a real sports and social hub in each neighborhood. Here's a quick fact for you. Here in the UK, 1 in 3 of our children is now growing up displaying signs of obesity by the age of 11. We clearly need facilities to deliver significant health benefits, and this is where squash can lead the way in projects like this, because we all know that squash is one of the very best activities for delivering health and fitness and prolonging healthy lives. So naturally, we want squash to be at the heart of these new clubs. Above all, we want them to be fun places. And we have partners like Johnny Powell, a 10-year sponsor of the Kent Open, to help provide some fabulous, fun, social facilities. Johnny's company, 501 Entertainment, is using technology to update some familiar pub games. He started off with darts, and he's now selling games like social darts to a wide range of pubs and sports clubs. And guess what? Guess where the clubs are? I'll tell you. He's selling his pub games to some of these huge pickleball centers that are growing up in the States. Now, in business terms, those venues are not always described as pickleball clubs. Much of the literature describes them as entertainment complexes. I once described Johnny many years ago as a one-man fun palace after a late-night Kent Open party, and that's exactly what he is helping to build in America, clubs based around fun. And we want Johnny to help us keep some of that fun over here in the UK as well, and not export everything to America. So the people we are looking to partner with must share that kind of vision, the need to make squash fun again and make it popular again. The game is suffering because we play squash inside our little private boxes. And most people in squash at management level, committee level, I've found have such a narrow vision when it comes to growing our great game. We play our sport inside a box, but we absolutely need to think outside the box to grow the numbers back up again. I have loads of discussions all the time with friends all over the world. We discuss new clubs, and the topic always comes up that we're effectively running 2 small businesses side by side. We're running a sports club and a social space. And a lot of small clubs, sadly, have no idea how to do either of those jobs effectively or professionally. So we need new people with new ideas. We need people who understand technology. We need people who understand business, people who understand how to build audiences. We need coaches who can deliver wave after wave of happy, healthy children. And we need to recruit people from the fitness industry, bring them into squash, and teach us all they know about the constant innovation in the fitness sector and the science of selling membership packages. Believe me, make no mistake, that is very much a science. I want to tell you that the whole ethos of Squash 200 is to drive down the building costs, just as Carlos explained, so that the startup business costs are drastically reduced as well. Thanks to Lee and Nick and all of our business partners, designers, architects, and experts in various essential fields, we have a very strong, experienced team who can help our clients every step of the way. We can hold your hand all the way through, from discussing your dream of owning your own club to putting that vision down on paper, including everything on your wish list, then going through the whole planning process, through to the build, the fitting out, and then on to the delivery. We even have a finance company on board who have huge experience in the sports marketplace, funding new projects like this. So please call in at the Squash 200 table, kindly set up by the Squash Summit, and in a few minutes we can chat about all things squash. I just want to finish off by talking about our plans for World Squash Day later this year. We have moved the date to October the 9th because of a few COVID issues, and we are working on a number of fantastic projects to help the game to relaunch after the trauma of the past 12 months. When I look around the Squash Summit, it's pretty clear that we have some real genius people here in squash. Not only Nick at Melior Sports and Johnny Powell and the Sportageous team, we also have Robert Pacey from Squash Republic. Rob is a genius designer and he's produced the new World Squash Day logos. I actually took ownership of these at 3 o'clock this morning, and he was working flat out yesterday to get them ready for the Squash Summit. So a huge thank you to Rob over there in Vancouver. Last October, we had to dream up some COVID-safe activities for World Squash Day. But this year, we hope we can celebrate returning to the courts in most countries around the planet. We know that every squash player will be itching to get back on court, but until lockdown is over, we won't know if we've lost any of our casual players. So right now, I'm working on some really exciting plans with numerous partners for everyone to join forces on World Squash Day to reignite our sport. The theme agreed with the World Federation is to put the fun back into squash, which is really perfect after such a tough year for us all. I will be encouraging every nation to stage events that will attract local and national TV coverage. And once again, we want to have World Squash Day lighting up social media. And once again, we will be partnering with the PSA Foundation. James Roberts did a great job with the World Squash Day auction last year to help raise funds for the PSA Foundation We Are One campaign, and we will aim to make it even bigger and better this year. After I speak, Adriana Alea will be coming on shortly after the Q&A to tell you more about the PSA Foundation. So I will quickly hand you back to Kanzi, and we can discuss any questions you may have about Squash 200 or World Squash Day. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alan. We really appreciate your time. So I'm going to kick this off by reading a question from one of, I don't even know how to describe him. I'm just going to say one of my favorite people for now, Paul Selby. So Paul, actually, we dealt a lot together, especially me growing up, because he was my first sponsor when I was a kid. So super supportive, always watched my matches, always believed in me. So shout out to Paul.
Good morning,
okay.
Paul.
So Paul is asking, the hardest aspect of building new facilities is access to funding. The will to build is still there, but the difficulty in financing the project is a big hurdle. How do you envision being able to gain the necessary finance to build those?
Well, thanks to Nick at Melior Sports, we now have a funding partner, the Harrow finance company, which has huge experience in funding development projects in many, many sports. So I will happily speak to Paul after the show and fill him in on some of those very important details. There are two major major issues, Kanzi and Paul. One is finding the land and two is finding the money. Finding the land is one issue, but we think we have a solution now with the funding and the finance.
Amazing. Thank you so much. More of a personal question from Mira. Hi, Alan. What's the secret? How do you manage your time as a promoter, squash entrepreneur, World Squash Day, founder, journalist? Inspiring.
I used to say it was a combination of ADHD and the Holy Spirit. Oh, and no sleep.
No sleep for sure is the main one. Another question from Dave. Alan, how do you convince leisure center owners who have squash courts not to use them for more lucrative activities such as spinning, yoga, etc.?
Keep them busy with squash.
Exactly.
The whole squash community needs to work harder to keep all those squash busy, those courts busy, because if they are generating revenue, you're showing the owners that squash can make money for their business. The other 100%. Choice, of course, is talk to me about building your own clubs, then you run the whole show.
I think it's very common for squash courts around the world to misuse squash. So I've seen so many different situations where like people put a ping pong table inside, yes. Or people book the court to have kickboxing classes or to just use it for storage or things like that. So
it feels wrong. Just feels wrong.
For sure. Okay, let's take on another question from Richard. Playing devil's advocate, why do we need squash and squash clubs? We all love it, but squash needs to be able to get its message across to non-squash players in non-squash situations.
Totally agree with every word of that question. The biggest issue that we have, like I say, is squash courts being hidden away inside private buildings. So with more open air courts, we can be visible alongside tennis, padel and pickleball in the open air, and we're then on a level playing field. Our game suddenly becomes visible.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Alan, for your time. We really appreciate it. There's other people who have been asking more questions in the comment section. So, in the Q&A section. So if you want to, after the conference, when we announce the break for the networking session, feel free to go there. And then you can answer more questions at that time.
Thanks, Kanzi. I'd just like to remind everybody I'm on table 32, so we can have a great chat for the rest of the day. Thank you, Kanzi, and thank you to the whole team at Sportageous. A great, great event. Thank you.
Thank you so much.